The invitation. The city lights burned bright that evening, glowing like restless jewels against the Los Angeles skyline. From her window on the 23rd floor of the Hale Corporation Tower, Naomi Clark watched the streets far below with quiet detachment, her hands still smelling faintly of disinfectant and lemon oil. For nearly 7 years she had polished those very marble floors, scrubbed the mirrors in the executive washrooms, and emptied the trash bins of men who never even looked her in the eye. Naomi had learned to move invisibly through the building, a shadow in blue overalls and worn sneakers, as powerful men discussed billion-dollar deals and congratulated themselves on fortunes built from other people's sweat. Among them, the loudest and most arrogant was Richard Hale, the man who owned not only the building but nearly everything inside it, including, in some sense, her livelihood. Richard Hale liked to laugh. He laughed at his rivals when their stocks fell. He laughed at women when they dared to speak with intelligence, and he laughed most cruelly at those he considered beneath him. Naomi, with her mop and cleaning cart, had always been his favorite target. When he passed her in the hallway, he would make exaggerated bows, mockingly tipping his silk tie as if she were royalty. When she bent over to polish the brass elevator railings, he would throw comments to his colleagues like, "Now that's dedication. Too bad it's wasted on a mop." They would chuckle, clink their glasses, and walk away as if she were not even human. Naomi never replied. She carried the silence with grace, but deep inside every insult added another stone to the wall she had been quietly building. A wall not of bitterness, but of patience. On an ordinary Tuesday evening, when the offices were quieting down and Naomi's shift had just begun, Richard appeared again. This time he was nice. One alone. He had his wife Vanessa with him, a woman whose beauty was polished to icy perfection and whose eyes carried the same cruelty as her husband. Naomi was bent over her cart, stacking folded towels, when Richard strolled toward her, golden envelope in hand. His grin was wide, his voice dripping with mockery. "Naomi, Naomi, Naomi," he drawled, as if savoring the sound of her name like cheap wine. "You've been such a loyal little helper here. Vanessa and I were just talking. What's a celebration without including everyone, Even the, how should I say, unsung heroes." He turned the envelope between his fingers, letting its edges catch the light. "So here you go. You're officially invited to the Hale Foundation Charity Gala this Saturday night. Black tie, of course, ultra-formal dress code. I'm sure you've got something glamorous tucked away in your closet. Don't you, darling?" Vanessa let out a laugh sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, Richard, stop," she said, though her tone suggested she wanted him to go on. "She'll probably show up in her cleaning uniform. Imagine that." The laughter that followed was cruel, rehearsed, and deliberate. The envelope was thrust into Naomi's hand before she could even react, its thick paper warm against her skin. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice to a stage whisper she was meant to hear. "Come on, Naomi. Prove to everyone you belong. Unless you're too scared, of course." Naomi's eyes met his for the briefest moment. There was no anger, no flustered shame, only a calm that unsettled him. She closed the cart drawer slowly, placed the towel neatly on top, and with a steady voice replied, "Thank you, Mr. Hale. I'll be there." Her words were neither timid nor boastful, but something else entirely, assured, almost ominous in their certainty. For the first time in years, Richard Hale's smirk faltered. He quickly forced it back into place, covering the unease that flickered across his expression. "Splendid," he said with false cheer. "Can't wait." When they walked away, Naomi stood still in the hallway, golden envelope clutched in her hand. Her reflection in the glass wall stared back at her, overalls stained from bleach, hair tied back in a no-nonsense knot, eyes tired but unbroken. Slowly, deliberately, she slipped the envelope into her bag and finished her shift as if nothing had happened. But inside, something had awakened, a storm she had long kept buried. That night, in her small apartment 2 blocks away from the industrial district, Naomi placed the invitation on her kitchen table beneath the yellow glow of a single lamp. Around her, the walls bore the modest decorations of a life lived simply, a few family photographs, a hand-stitched quilt draped across the couch, shelves lined with second-hand books. She sat for a long time, studying the gold seal with the embossed Hale crest. To anyone else, it would have seemed like a cruel prank meant to humiliate her. To Naomi, it was something else entirely. It was the opening she had been waiting for. She stood and crossed the room to a tall wooden cabinet in the corner, one she rarely touched. From its top shelf, hidden beneath a folded cloth, she retrieved a small velvet box. The fabric was faded, the edges worn, but inside lay something that shimmered even in the dim light. A silver pendant etched with an intricate crest, and next to it, an old photograph of a smiling man in a tuxedo. Naomi's fingers trembled as she traced the outline of the pendant. It had belonged to her father, once a respected figure in the city before betrayal and tragedy had reduced his family to whispers and shadows. Few knew the truth of what had happened, and fewer still cared to remember. But Naomi remembered. Every day she carried that memory with her, waiting for the right moment to bring it into the light. Richard Hale thought he was playing a cruel joke, but what he had truly done was throw open a door Naomi had been waiting years to walk through. She looked at the photograph again, her father's warm eyes and confident smile speaking across decades. "I'll do it, Papa," she whispered. "I'll make them remember who we were, and I'll show them who I am." She returned the pendant to the box, but this time, instead of tucking it back into hiding, she set it on the table beside the invitation. The two items lay side by side, one symbolizing cruelty, the other resilience. Together, they formed the beginning of a plan. The following days at work unfolded in strange silence. Naomi went about her duties as usual, yet whispers trailed behind her. Someone had overheard Richard boasting about the invitation. "She won't dare show up," he had laughed to his colleagues, "and if she does, it'll be the entertainment of the decade." Bets were placed in hushed tones. Some believed she would run away in humiliation, others thought she might appear in something ridiculous, confirming their assumptions. But no one expected what Naomi was preparing. Every evening, after her shift, she visited an elderly seamstress named Marisol, a family friend who had once worked for Naomi's mother long ago. In Marisol's tiny studio, filled with the scent of fabric and lavender, Naomi stood as measurements were taken, fabrics draped, and secrets shared. Piece by piece, an image of transformation began to take shape, not just of cloth and thread, but of a woman reclaiming her identity. By Friday night, Naomi's heart pounded with a strange mix of fear and anticipation. She stood once again in her apartment, the gown Marisol had tailored hanging against the closet door. Its deep emerald silk shimmered like forest leaves under moonlight, its design echoing the timeless elegance of another era. On the table lay the pendant and the invitation, waiting. Naomi pressed the pendant to her chest and closed her eyes. She could almost hear her father's voice telling her to stand tall, to remember that dignity was a crown no one could strip away. She was ready. Saturday arrived with the city buzzing under clear skies. The Hale mansion on the hills was ablaze with light, its grand halls filled with the powerful and the privileged. Richard Hale stood at the entrance with Vanessa, greeting guests, his laughter booming as he told them to wait for tonight's real surprise. Inside, crystal chandeliers sparkled, champagne flowed, and music swelled like a declaration of wealth. Among the crowd, whispers spread of the janitor who had been invited. Some sneered, others waited with curiosity. Richard thrived in the attention, basking in the expectation of someone else's humiliation. But as the evening reached its height, a hush fell over the grand staircase. Heads turned, conversations stilled, and there, at the top of the stairs, stood Naomi Clark. No longer in overalls and sneakers, but radiant in emerald silk, her hair swept into an elegant updo, her eyes steady and unflinching. Every step she took down the marble stairs was deliberate, echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. Murmurs rippled through the room, mockery dying on lips that suddenly hesitated. She did not hurry, nor did she falter. She moved as though she had always belonged in that world, as though the chandeliers and marble had been waiting for her return. And when she reached the bottom of the staircase, she lifted her chin and looked directly at Richard Hale. For the first time in his life, he found himself unable to laugh. The transformation. Naomi had never felt the weight of eyes the way she did that night as she stepped into the grand ballroom of the Hale mansion. Every gaze burned, some with open mockery, others with veiled curiosity, but not one with kindness. The wealthy elite had gathered under chandeliers that spilled golden light, each guest draped in fabrics that whispered of fortunes. Men stood with their polished cufflinks catching the glow, women wound, with diamonds glittering like frost upon their throats, and waiters floated between them carrying trays of champagne that seemed to sparkle with arrogance. Naomi knew this world. She had once walked its polished floors not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. That was long ago, before betrayal had stripped her of everything and forced her into a life of scrubbing and silence. But tonight, as she walked in a gown that shimmered like starlight, she was no longer the invisible cleaner in blue overalls. She was a woman with purpose, and her presence was a silent storm waiting to break. The room was still adjusting to the shock of her arrival when Richard Hale's voice carried above the murmurs. He forced a laugh, but it rang hollow, the sound of a man trying to cling to control. "Well, well, well," he called out, his champagne glass raised. "It seems even the staff can clean up nicely when given the chance." A ripple of laughter followed, but weaker than he had hoped. Naomi did not flinch. Instead, she turned her head slightly, her calm gaze sweeping the crowd with the composure of a queen entering her court. She did not need to speak to silence them further. Her mere presence unsettled them. Naomi moved gracefully across the ballroom, her emerald gown flowing behind her like liquid silk. Each step she took echoed memories of her childhood, when she had run through these same halls, her father's hand steady on her shoulder, guiding her toward a future that had been stolen. She remembered how her father had once hosted galas of his own, where music had filled the air not with vanity but with joy. That joy had died the night Richard Hale seized everything, twisting wealth into a weapon. For years, Naomi had endured the humiliation of working in the shadow of the man who destroyed her family, but in enduring, she had gathered strength, like coals hidden in ash. And ow! Those coals burned quietly within her, preparing for fire. As she reached the edge of the ballroom, she found herself face to face with Vanessa Hale. The woman's smile was sharp, her eyes cold, though beneath the surface there flickered a nervous curiosity. "Well, Naomi," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with disdain, "I must say, I didn't expect you to actually show up. And in that dress, where on earth did you find something so—" She paused, searching for a word cruel enough. "So dramatic?" Naomi tilted her head, her calmness unshaken. "This dress," she said softly, her voice carrying more power than the room's chatter, "belonged to my mother. She wore it to the last gala held in this mansion before circumstances changed." The words were measured, but their weight fell heavy. Vanessa blinked, unsettled by the quiet strength in Naomi's tone. "How quaint," she murmured quickly, masking her unease with a brittle laugh. But the exchange had already drawn curious ears, and whispers spread. A dress tied to history, to the past of the mansion itself. Questions began to surface, though none dared ask them aloud. Naomi did not linger. She moved through the crowd with purpose, accepting a glass of water from a passing waiter and offering him a small smile, the first warmth she had shown that evening. Unlike the others, his eyes met hers, not with mockery, but with simple respect. That moment reminded Naomi why she was here. This was not about revenge alone. It was about dignity, about reclaiming not just her own identity, but the truth her father had died protecting. Meanwhile, Richard Hale watched her from across the room, his jaw tight. He had expected tears, humiliation, perhaps even a retreat in shame. Instead, Naomi radiated a composure that unsettled him. He whispered harshly to Vanessa, "She's just playing a role. She'll slip up. She's a janitor in a borrowed gown, nothing more." Vanessa nodded, though her eyes betrayed uncertainty. Richard raised his glass again, louder this time, determined to draw the crowd's focus back to himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "tonight is about charity, about generosity, about remembering that even the smallest hands can make a difference. His words dripped with condescension as he glanced in Naomi's direction, as if mocking her very existence. Yet the longer the evening wore on, the more obvious it became that his performance was strained. Naomi's silence was louder than his laughter. At the far side of the room, Naomi found a quiet corner where an antique mirror reflected her image. She studied herself carefully, the gown, the pendant hidden beneath its folds, the steady rise and fall of her breath. She thought of her father's last words to her, whispered before the world collapsed. Never let them decide who you are. Hold your head high, and one day the truth will speak for itself. Tonight, she realized, that day had come. She touched the pendant through the fabric, feeling its cool shape against her skin, and with it, the memory of everything Richard had stolen. Her plan was not yet revealed, but it was unfolding exactly as she intended. Every second she remained poised, chipped away at his power. As music resumed and couples drifted to the dance floor, Naomi stepped forward, joining the current of the evening. She declined dance offers politely, each refusal executed with such grace that it only added to the intrigue surrounding her. She was no longer invisible. Every move she made, every word she spoke carried weight. The same people who once ignored her were now whispering about her, speculating about who she really was, why she seemed so composed, why her presence felt less like intrusion and more like revelation. Slowly, the laughter that had greeted her arrival dissolved into uncertainty. Richard, however, could not bear the shifting tide. He crossed the room with the determination of a man reclaiming ground, planting himself in front of Naomi with a smile that was more snarl than charm. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked. His voice was low, meant for her ears alone. "I hope you're making the most of this, because once tonight is over, you'll go back to mopping floors where you belong." Naomi looked at him steadily, her expression unreadable. Then, with a calmness that unnerved him, she replied, "I belong where truth belongs, Mr. Hale, and truth has a way of finding its place no matter how long it's buried." His smile faltered again, and though he quickly recovered, Naomi saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. She knew then that the balance had already begun to shift. She had not come to beg acceptance. She had come to remind him that the past was not dead, and that the dignity he tried to strip from her had never left her hands. The night pressed on, but every hour that passed left Richard more unsettled. His guests, once eager to mock, now watched Naomi with fascination. The gala, intended as a stage for her humiliation, was slowly transforming into her stage for revelation. And though she had not yet spoken her truth aloud, the very air seemed to hum with its promise. Richard Hale did not realize it yet, but the joke he had so cruelly crafted was no longer his. It belonged to Naomi now, and she was just beginning to let it unfold. The grand entrance of truth, the orchestra struck a softer note, the violins weaving through the air like a thread of silk, yet the atmosphere of the gala remained heavy with tension. Naomi had been among the guests for only an hour, but the room had already begun to feel different. Where mockery once reigned, there now lingered an unspoken unease. Some guests avoided her gaze, uncomfortable with the composure of a woman they had been conditioned to dismiss. Others could not stop staring, trying to place her face, her posture, her quiet confidence. It was as though a memory hovered at the edge of recognition, but none dared to name it. Naomi, however, was acutely aware of every detail. Her emerald gown brushed the polished marble with each step, her pendant pressing gently against her skin beneath the fabric, and her heart beating a rhythm that matched the distant drums of the music. She had prepared for this moment, but preparation was not the same as living it. She could feel the weight of her father's legacy in every breath she took, and the knowledge that she was no longer merely enduring humiliation, but beginning to shift the balance of power. What Richard had designed as her public downfall had instead become the prelude to his own undoing, though he did not yet fully realize it. Richard Hale, desperate to claw back control, had not left her side for long. He prowled the ballroom, circling conversations, pulling attention toward himself, but his eyes flicked back to Naomi with a restlessness that betrayed his growing fear. He had expected her to crumble, yet she stood as a steady flame, unmoved by the wind of mockery. Vanessa, too, watched Naomi closely. Though she hid behind a thin smile, her hand clutched her glass so tightly that the stem trembled. The crowd could sense it. Power, once firmly in Richard's grip, was no longer absolute. Something intangible had shifted. At last, the evening's master of ceremonies announced that Richard Hale himself would deliver the annual address of generosity, the speech that justified the wealth and splendor on display by painting it as charitable duty. Guests gathered in front of the stage, glasses raised in anticipation, their applause loud but rehearsed. Richard took his place at the podium, his figure tall, his tuxedo flawless, his grin forced but confident. He began with polished words about legacy, philanthropy, and the responsibility of the fortunate to aid the less fortunate. Each sentence was coated in honey, but Naomi could taste the poison beneath it. Standing near the edge of the crowd, Naomi listened intently. She saw the way Richard gestured toward the gilded ceiling, as if he were blessing the very air with his benevolence. She noticed how he slipped her name into his speech, disguising it as a compliment but twisting it into mockery. "And tonight," he said with a smirk, "we are joined by someone very special indeed. Our loyal Naomi, who proves that even the humblest beginnings can be present among the finest company. Let us all remember that charity begins when we invite even those from the margins to stand among us." The crowd chuckled uneasily, not sure whether to laugh or to hide their discomfort. Naomi's pulse quickened. She could have remained silent, as she had so many times before. She could have let his words pass like another insult carried away by years. But tonight was not like those nights. Tonight was the night she had chosen. Slowly, deliberately, Naomi stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble like the strike of a gavel. Conversations hushed, laughter died mid-breath, and even the orchestra fell silent, their bows pausing on the strings. All eyes turned to her as she walked steadily toward the stage. Richard faltered for a fraction of a second, his reefily prepared rhythm breaking. "Naomi," he said, forcing a laugh, "did you wish to say something?" He expected her to retreat, to stammer, to crumble. Instead, she climbed the steps with measured grace, her gown trailing behind her, and took her place beside him at the podium. The sight of her there, equal in height, equal in presence, sent a murmur through the crowd. Naomi placed her hands lightly on the podium, her fingers brushing the polished wood, and raised her eyes to meet the audience. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady, carrying farther than Richard's booming arrogance ever had. "I thank Mr. Hale for his kind words," she began, her tone composed. "But I must correct a small misunderstanding. I did not come here tonight as a guest of charity, nor as the subject of amusement. I came because this house, these halls, once belonged to my family, and though time and betrayal tried to erase that truth, I am here to remind you that it cannot be erased." A ripple passed through the audience, surprise, disbelief, and the spark of curiosity. Richard stiffened, trying to laugh it off. "What an imagination," he said loudly, addressing the guests. "You see what happens when we open our doors too wide? Even the staff begin to think they belong to dynasties." His words were harsh, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. Naomi, undeterred, reached to her neckline and drew forth the pendant that had rested hidden beneath her gown. Its silver crest gleamed in the light, intricate and unmistakable. Gasps filled the room as several older guests recognized it immediately. The crest of Edward Clark, Naomi's father, once a respected partner in the Hale fortune, before his sudden and suspicious death 2 decades earlier. Naomi's eyes swept the crowd as she held the pendant for all to see. "Some of you remember my father," she continued, her voice deepening with quiet power. "Edward Clark was a man of honor, a man who built not only wealth but trust, and some of you also remember the night he vanished and how swiftly his empire was absorbed. You were told stories, half-truths, designed to make you forget, but I did not forget. I was there, a child torn from her home, forced to grow up in the shadows of lies. And for years I scrubbed these floors, invisible, silent, watching the man who betrayed him grow rich on the ruin of others." The silence in the hall was suffocating. Every eye fixed on Richard now, not with admiration, but with dawning suspicion. Richard's face flushed, his grin frozen, his glass trembling in his hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Naomi's calmness disarmed him, her presence making him smaller by the second. One guest, a senator's wife, whispered audibly to her companion, "That crest. I saw it at Clark's last gala, the year before." She trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Another murmured, "Could it be true? Did Hale?" But none finished the thought. They didn't need to. The truth, once cracked open, spilled silently into every corner of the room. Naomi lowered the pendant back against her chest, her hand steady. "I do not seek your pity," she said, her voice unwavering. "I seek only what my father taught me, to stand with dignity, no matter how hard the world tries to strip it away. Tonight you invited me as a joke, but I will leave you with a truth that will outlast your laughter. Power gained through betrayal does not endure. It trembles, it falters, and eventually, it falls." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Naomi stepped back from the podium, her poise unshaken, her eyes meeting Richard's for the briefest moment. In that glance was everything: grief, defiance, and a silent promise that his time of untouchable arrogance was ending. Then she turned, descending the stage with the same calm grace with which she had entered. The crowd parted for her, not with scorn, but with reverent silence. Richard Hale stood alone at the podium, his speech forgotten, his carefully built facade cracking under the weight of whispers. For the first time in decades, the empire he had constructed on lies felt unsteady, and Naomi, the janitor he had mocked, had become the one voice that no one in that room could ignore. The revelation, the silence in the ballroom was so thick it seemed to swallow the very air. The chandeliers sparkled as they had for 100 nights of Hale family celebrations, but tonight their brilliance only threw Richard Hale's face into harsher relief. His skin flushed crimson, his jaw rigid, and yet his hands trembled slightly on the podium. For a man who thrived on controlling every narrative, this sudden loss of grip was unthinkable. His guests, senators, CEOs, investors, and heirs, had begun to whisper to one another, their murmurs rising like the rustle of leaves before a storm. And all of it was because of one woman in emerald silk, who now stood near the edge of the crowd with a pendant gleaming softly against her heart. Richard cleared his throat, trying to summon his usual arrogance. "What a charming story," he said, his voice brittle, his laugh forced. "Our Naomi has always had a vivid imagination. Let's all applaud her bravery for entertaining us with fairy tales tonight." He clapped his hands together, urging others to join. The sound was thin, reluctant, unconvincing. A few guests gave polite pats, but the majority remained frozen, their eyes still fixed on Naomi. They were no longer laughing, they were listening, and that terrified Richard. Naomi stepped forward again, not rushing, not forcing, but commanding the space with her calm presence. "It is not a fairy tale," she said, her voice firm, carrying to every corner of the hall. "It is a history that many of you have chosen to forget, because it was more comfortable to believe Richard Hale's lies. My father, Edward Clark, trusted his partner. He trusted him with business, with friendship, with the future of this very foundation, and that trust was betrayed." A sharp intake of breath moved through the crowd. The older guests, those who had known Edward Clark personally, shifted uneasily. They remembered the sudden collapse of his holdings, the rumors of debts, the whispers that he had mismanaged funds. They remembered Richard Hale rising in the aftermath, sweeping up assets at bargain prices, turning disaster into his fortune. For years they had accepted Richard's narrative, but now, standing before them, was the living evidence that the story had been wrong. Naomi reached into the clutch she carried and drew out a small stack of documents. Her fingers were steady, though her heart pounded with the weight of what she was about to reveal. "These are not memories alone," she said. "They are proof." She unfolded the papers, their crisp edges gleaming under the chandeliers. Financial records, contracts, letters signed in Richard Hale's hand, documents that show how he siphoned assets from Clark Hale, transferring them into hidden accounts while framing my father for losses he never caused. It was not my father's ruinous mistake. It was Richard's calculated theft. Gasps spread through the hall like wildfire. Faces turned to Richard, searching his expression, hunting for denial, for reassurance. But Richard's lips moved without sound, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. Naomi laid the documents on the edge of the podium, each page a blade cootie, rang through the silence. One man in the front row, a gray-haired investor who had been one of Edward Clark's closest allies, stepped forward. His voice trembled with outrage. "I remember those figures. Edward swore something was wrong, but no one would listen. Hale, is this true? Did you forge these ledgers?" His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the grief of realizing he had betrayed his friend by believing the wrong man. Richard's composure crumbled. "This is absurd," he sputtered, his hand slamming the podium. "She's a janitor, a nobody. You're all seriously considering her word over mine? I built this empire. I gave you all wealth, connections, opportunities. She's nothing but a girl who cleans toilets." His desperation rang louder than his denial. It was no longer the voice of a master of ceremonies. It was the voice of a man whose empire was slipping through his fingers in real time. Naomi did not flinch at his venom. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I am not ashamed of the work I have done to survive," she said, her tone unyielding. "Every floor I polished, every room I scrubbed, was an act of strength. I stood where you tried to push me down and I endured. But do not mistake survival for weakness, Richard. I carry truth with me, and truth cannot be silenced by mockery." Her words struck the room like thunder. The crowd, once complicit in Richard's arrogance, now shifted in its loyalty. Guests who had been whispering doubts now spoke openly, their voices rising. "I always wondered about Clark's death," one muttered. "It was too sudden." Another added, "And how did Hale manage to double his wealth within a year? It never made sense." The murmurs grew into a wave of suspicion, and that wave was turning against Richard. Vanessa Hale, pale and shaken, clutched her husband's arm. "Richard," she hissed, her mask of composure cracking. "They believe her. Do something. Stop this." But Richard could only glare at Naomi, his fury mixing with fear. For the first time in his life, he could not control the story. Then, as if the night needed no further drama, one of the Foundation's major benefactors, an older woman with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes, rose from her seat. Eleanor Grant was known for her philanthropy and her uncompromising integrity, and when she spoke, the room always listened. "Naomi Clark," she said, her voice deliberate, "if what you claim is true, if Richard Hale truly stole your father's fortune and destroyed his legacy, then I will personally ensure an inquiry is launched. The Hale Foundation will not stand on lies. We will not allow a thief to masquerade as a benefactor." The statement landed like a hammer blow. Richard's empire had always depended not only on wealth, but on the trust of high society. And now, in front of his most important allies, that trust was splintering. Naomi inclined her head slightly toward Eleanor, gratitude flickering in her eyes. She had not expected immediate support, but she had counted on the power of truth to resonate with those who still valued honor. Richard tried one last time to regain control, his voice breaking under strain. "You fools!" he shouted. "Do you know who I am? Do you think she, this maid, can take me down? I'll bury her. I'll bury anyone who sides with her." His words, meant to intimidate, only sealed his downfall. The guests recoiled from his fury, disgust replacing admiration. Even Vanessa's hand slipped from his arm, her eyes narrowing as if she had finally glimpsed the monster beneath the charm. Naomi stood in the center of the storm, unshaken. "You already buried yourself, Richard," she said softly, but her voice carried with a clarity that silenced the hall. "Every lie you told, every cruelty you inflicted, every life you crushed to build your empire, it has all led you here. Tonight the truth walked through your door, and it will not leave with me alone. It will stay in their minds, in their voices, in their judgments, and you can do nothing to stop it." The ballroom erupted, not with applause, but with a swell of voices, questions, accusations, demands for accountability. Reporters, whom Richard had invited to mock Naomi, now scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing not at her humiliation, but at his disgrace. What had begun as his cruel entertainment had become the night of his unraveling. Naomi stepped back from the podium, her mission complete for now. She had not destroyed him with fire or vengeance, but with truth wielded like a blade. and as she walked away from the stage, the crowd parted once more, not in mockery this time, but in a silence heavy with respect. Richard Hale had wanted her to be the evening's spectacle, and she was, but not in the way he had planned. He was the one exposed, and she was the one who stood untouchable in dignity, the triumph. The ballroom had never felt heavier than in the moments after Naomi's words settled into the air. The chandeliers above, once symbols of Richard Hale's grandeur, seemed now to illuminate only his downfall. His face was pale, his suit damp with perspiration, and his forced smile had long since dissolved into a grimace of fury and fear. Around him, the guests shifted like a restless tide, no longer orbiting around his power, but pulling away as if distance itself could cleanse them of their complicity. Naomi had exposed him, and there was no return to the illusion he had built. For Naomi, however, the storm was strangely calm. She felt as though a great weight had been lifted, one she had carried silently for more than 2 decades. The pendant on her chest no longer seemed a burden of grief, but a beacon of remembrance. She had spoken her father's truth into the world, and in doing so, reclaimed the dignity Richard had stolen. As she moved toward the grand doors of the ballroom, the crowd parted again, not in contempt but in acknowledgement. For the first time in years, she was not invisible. She was seen, not as a janitor to be mocked, but as a woman who had turned endurance into strength and silence into a weapon sharper than any blade. Richard's voice broke through the murmurs, raw and desperate. "You think this changes anything?" he barked, his arrogance fraying at the edges. "I still control the board. I still control the foundation. You—" His hand shook as he pointed at Naomi, his words spilling out like venom. "You're nothing without me. You've always been nothing. And when this night is over, everyone here will forget your little story. They'll come back to me, because they always do." But the words rang hollow, stripped of power by the shifting current of the room. Investors who had once praised him now turned away. A senator muttered something about public scandal. A woman in diamonds hissed to her husband that they should leave before they, too, were tainted by his disgrace. The whispers grew louder, the voices firmer, until even Richard could hear it clearly. They were not coming back to him. He had lost them. It was then that Eleanor Grant stepped forward once more, her presence commanding in its quiet authority. "You are mistaken, Richard," she said, her voice as clear as the ringing of a bell. "We will not forget. In fact, I will make certain that none of us here tonight can forget. Tomorrow I will personally convene an Regency meeting of the Foundation's trustees. Your accounts, your contracts, your dealings, they will all be examined. And I promise you this, if even half of what Naomi Clark has revealed is true, your reign is finished." The room stirred with approval. For the first time that evening, applause broke out, not for Richard, but for the woman who had stood against him. Naomi froze, her breath catching in her throat as she realized the clapping was for her. It was not the thunderous applause of shallow admiration, but the steady rhythm of respect, like a rising tide lifting her higher with every beat. She had not come for their validation, but to hear it now was to feel the walls of her father's stolen legacy tremble with vindication. Richard staggered back, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the marble floor. "You can't do this to me," he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes darted to Vanessa, but she had already stepped away, her face cold, her loyalty shattered. He was truly alone. The man who had mocked Naomi as invisible was now invisible himself, swallowed by the scorn of the very world he once controlled. Naomi did not gloat. She did not sneer or throw back the insults he had once hurled at her. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her expression serene. "This is not about destroying you, Richard," she said, her voice carrying even in the sea of whispers. "It is about restoring what was stolen. It is about remembering the man who built with honor while you destroyed with greed. I do not need revenge to stand here tonight. I only need truth, and truth has already done its work." With those words, Naomi turned and walked toward the grand doors. The applause followed her, rising louder, filling the hall with a sound that would echo in memory long after the night was over. The great golden doors opened, and she stepped out into the cool night air. The stars above glittered like diamonds against the dark velvet sky, and for the first time in years, Naomi felt as though the heavens themselves bore witness to her father's vindication. In the days that followed, the world moved quickly. News of the gala spread through newspapers, television, and social media with a force no one could stop. Reporters who had come expecting to capture the humiliation of a janitor now published stories of courage, betrayal, and the fall of a billionaire. Financial watchdogs descended on the Hale empire, uncovering layers of corruption that confirmed Naomi's claims. Investors withdrew, partners severed ties, and in a matter of weeks, Richard Hale's empire crumbled like a house of cards. His name, once spoken with fear and admiration, became synonymous with scandal and disgrace. Naomi, however, did not seek the spotlight. She returned quietly to her modest apartment, though her life was no longer the same. Eleanor Grant reached out with an offer, a seat on the board of a new foundation to replace Richard's corrupted legacy. But Naomi asked for something different. She requested scholarships for the children of service workers, funds for single mothers, programs for those whose voices were always silenced in the corridors of wealth. She had lived in visibility, and she knew how many others still lived it. Her victory would not end with her. It would ripple outward, giving others the dignity that had once been denied her. 1 month later, Naomi walked once more through the towering glass doors of the Hale Corporation, only this time it bore a new name. The Clark found it. Ion for integrity and opportunity. The marble floors gleamed as they always had, but now each polished step reminded her not of servitude, but of survival. She paused in the lobby, her reflection shimmering against the glass wall. She no longer wore overalls or carried a mop. She wore a simple but elegant suit, her hair tied neatly, the silver pendant still resting near her heart. Employees stopped as she passed, not out of mockery but with respect. Some nodded, some whispered her name in admiration. She did not linger for recognition, but she felt it all the same. Naomi Clark had walked into the gala as a target of ridicule and had walked out as a symbol of strength. She had transformed humiliation into triumph, silence into truth, and invisibility into undeniable presence. And as she stepped into her new office, overlooking the city that had once turned its back on her, Naomi whispered softly, almost to herself, "They invited me as a joke. I stayed as a reminder. Never underestimate the quiet ones." The words settled into the air like a final verdict, a truth that no scandal, no wealth, no betrayal could ever erase.